Can we go? Okay, wonderful. So welcome to this third meeting of our Reconstructing Carnap webinar series. So I would like to remind everybody, and for whoever is new, that our webinar series examines Carnap's philosophy in light of contemporary debates in epistemology, logical empiricism, and analytic metaphysics. Today we welcome Erich Reck. So Erich is works at UC Riverside. He is specialized in 19th-20th century philosophy, logic, the philosophy of mathematics, and the philosophy of science. He published several articles, edited several volumes and special issues on themes in Frege, Carnap, Wittgenstein, Cassirer, and Kuhn, which are also the subjects of his graduate and undergraduate teaching. I mentioned one of them, his upcoming monograph on Wittgenstein's Fregean inheritance for Elements series in philosophy of Wittgenstein for Cambridge University Press. So without any further ado, so I welcome Erich Reck, and the title of his talk today is in front of you finally. So Carnapian Explication, Probing its Criteria of Adequacy.
All right, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Yes.
Okay? All right.
Erich, you just tell me to slide. Okay.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm sorry about the complications. I'm not sure why it's not working on my side. So it'll be a little more basic now with PDFs, but I can get through it this way. Okay, so can you move on? Yeah, so my topic today is explication as conceived of and highlighted by Carnap. I'll focus on Carnap, but I will also consider some other philosophers, some other contributors to the debate about explication. The talk is a continuation of earlier work I've done that Luca also just pointed to. So I have 3 earlier articles that some of you may know on Carnapian Explication. And this is what I'm going to present will overlap to some degree, but it's meant to focus on a new part of it or a new aspect of it. I will not really talk about the history of Carnap's views, in particular Carnap's views in the Aufbau. So in that sense, this is a bit of a different talk in this series. I won't directly talk about, for example, quasi-analysis or rational reconstruction, although it'll come up along the way a little bit. Instead, it's more a history, a more general history, so not a history of Carnap's own views, but of how some remarks Carnap makes fit into a broader development. And my focus is on certain methodological questions. The kind of methodologies that have played central roles in the history of analytic philosophy, to some degree also the philosophy of science. So that's my main focus. Next one. Next slide. Yeah, so let me start with a very general observation, banal observation in a sense. So in philosophy, we all know there's this strong emphasis on conceptual analysis throughout its history, obviously also in analytic philosophy. Now, often this appeals to analysis involve a very strong understanding of analysis, an inflationary or realist understanding. And the basic idea is that by doing a conceptual analysis, we can get some substantive insights, especially metaphysical ones, perhaps also epistemological, ethical, or other insights. So that's meant to be the result of the analysis. The typical procedure is to look for, to try to identify necessary and sufficient conditions for the concepts. So some familiar cases of concepts that have been approached that way, as you all know, knowledge as justified true belief, or analysis of explanation in, say, causal terms, and so on, or say, Frege's analysis of number, and so on. So that's one methodology used throughout the history of philosophy and also within analytic philosophy. various strands in analytic philosophy. In terms of representatives for this strong view, I would point to the early Moore, the early Russell. Russell's views keep changing, but the early Russell. Later, just to pick one, Roderick Chisholm as roughly a contemporary of Carnap's. And one can trace this all the way to current analytic philosophy. So I think quite a bit of analytic metaphysics works with this strong sense of analysis. There may be, so I'm listing David Lewis or Kripke, you'd find maybe there are some debates about these particular figures, but I believe this using this strong sense of analysis has been quite influential. So let me call this methodology 1. Yes. Now, in my view, this is sort of a very broad brush view. I see two main alternatives. So if you look at the development of analytic philosophy, and the two main alternatives are both available, have become available since the mid-20th century. So on the one hand, as my number 2, there is the deflationary, partly pragmatic, and in some sense naturalistic approach or approaches for which Carnapian explication is central. So I see the discussion of Carnapian explication as bringing out and highlighting this method, this separate, distinctive methodology. There's also the alternative, what I consider equally deflationary, but more practice-based versions of ordinary language philosophy as yet another approach. So I have in mind people like Wittgenstein, Austin, Strawson, and so on. So again, number 1 is this very strong sense of analysis, using this very strong sense, realist sense of analysis. Since the early or mid-20th century, I take it these two were presented as alternatives. And I'm going to focus on 2, of course, although 3 will come up too. So as main representatives of this, my approach 2 here, of course, Carnap himself, in a number of his works, especially his later works. Quine often appeals to the notion of explication as central for his approach. It comes up in Nelson Goodman's work. Carl Hempel, in some of his writings, basically says he's using explication. And again, one can trace it both forward and back. So if you trace it back in time, following Carnap's own remarks, he points to Frege's work, his treatment of the natural numbers, for example, Russell's work, and here in particular, I would say the Russell from the 1910s, and Tarski. So those for Carnap are earlier models for him for explication. He basically says one can read them as using explication. Some of them will play a specific important role in what's going to follow, namely Goodman and Tarski in particular. Pointing forward, I see a lot of what's called formal philosophy, sometimes MPhi or mathematical philosophy. So just to mention one bigger name here, Hannes Leitgeb's work, I take to be very much in line with Carnap in that sense, as being guided by using Carnapian explication. And I'm mentioning one other collection by Hansen and Hendricks, Introduction to Formal Philosophy. So those I take to be representatives of this Carnapian approach. That's where explication is the methodology, basically. I think there are also connections to current conceptual engineering, although in that case, I think the connection is more complicated. It's how it connects to explication is looser in a way, although there is some literature on how they connect to each other. Now, in my very general perspective, it seems to me that the contrast between this more deflationary view, the Carnapian explication view, and the stronger view of analysis is not, maybe not in this, the audience here, but if I look at, say, my colleagues and many other people in analytic philosophy, the contrast isn't emphasized enough, is my sense often. So part of what I'm doing today is emphasizing that contrast. I think also the closeness or the connections between what I'm calling approach 2 and approach 3 aren't often focused on. Obviously, these two approaches differ in important ways, but I think there are also some interesting connections. And one other thing I'm going to do today is point to one of those connections. So between a Carnapian explication kind of methodology and a more ordinary language kind of philosophy, in particular, Strawson will play a role in what follows. All right. Okay, so let me turn to Carnapian explication. Just a quick reminder. I'm sure everyone here knows this already to some degree, but just to set the stage. So the main texts I have in mind are where that this comes up explicitly is Meaning and Explication from 1947, Logical Foundations of Probability from 1950, in particular the first chapter. And I think the first text in which the notion of explication gets mentioned explicitly, it's implicit earlier, is in the two concepts of probability. So what does Carnap mean by explication? Here is a quote from his 1950 Logical Foundations of Probability. He writes, by an explication, we understand the transformation of an inexact pre-scientific concept, the explicandum, into an exact concept, the explicatum. Here he talks about transforming a concept in other, like in his Meaning and Necessity, he puts it in terms of replacing the explicandum by the explicatum, and he, in Meaning and Necessity, has a slightly longer characterization, but let me leave it at that as a reminder. What are the stages when you use explication? So when you use this methodology, I would distinguish the following stages. First, you identify an explicandum, so a concept that you want to work on. And this identification, this first stage, may include a disambiguation or an initial clarification of what you are talking about. Then once you have identified and disambiguated the concept you are interested in, you provide an explicatum for it, and possibly several ones. So in many interesting cases, there isn't just one option, there are a number of different options. As the third stage, you then compare these options, these different explicata, and you evaluate them pragmatically using certain criteria that I'll come to in a moment. And then, of course, you apply the best or the best ones as conceptual tools. So I see that as the process of using this methodology. Okay. So I mentioned already briefly that Carnap, in his explicit discussion of explication, points to some earlier paradigmatic examples, so treatments of concepts that he thinks one can see as versions of explication. One is the Frege-Russell numbers, so constructing the natural numbers in terms of equivalence classes of classes. Another one he points to is Russell's theory of descriptions. And Tarski's account of truth is another paradigmatic earlier case for him. He also mentions some scientific examples or scientific models. So for example, the move from using the concept of fish to, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, piscis in zoology, or the adoption of a quantitative notion of temperature instead of just the ordinary warmer, colder distinction, or a more unusual example, less well-known example, the move to a mathematical notion of dimension, so a mathematically explicated notion of dimension in Karl Menger's work. So Menger was, of course, one of Carnap's colleagues in Vienna. In Carnap's own work, the main targets or the works I pointed to are clearly Meaning and Necessity, as the title shows, or Probability in the 1950 book. I take it also in his earlier work from the 1930s to 40s, the way he treats analyticity, the concept of analyticity can be seen as an explication or several attempts at explicating that term. Later, he points to the scientific concept of entropy in some late articles. And there are some hints in his late writings that he started to consider even explicating ethical concepts by using the emerging tools of decision theory and game theory, I think. whether to count the treatment of certain or various concepts in logischer Aufbau is an interesting question. I will largely leave that aside, although I can come back to it in the question and answer period. That's not my main focus today, although I think it is an interesting question too. All right. Okay, so Carnap mentions some criteria for adequacy, criteria of adequacy for explication, or desiderata, if you want. Since it's this more pragmatic approach, how should we evaluate a proposed explicatum or several explicata? Here is what he says explicitly. Again, I'm sure you all know this. A concept must fulfill the following requirements in order to be an adequate explicatum. 1, similarity to the explicandum. 2, exactness. 3, fruitfulness. And 4, simplicity. Now, if you look at these 4, now I'm getting close to the topic of my talk. If you look at these 4 criteria, if you look at 2, 3, and 4, I think they clearly are meant to push philosophy, the philosophy that uses the methodology of explication, in a scientific direction. I take these to be desiderata also for scientific theory construction. So Carnap is telling us, use these, among others, these desiderata or these criteria when using the explication method, thereby suggesting to make philosophy more scientific along the way. But what about the first one? What about similarity? That's the one I want to focus on. I think it hasn't been focused on very much yet, I mean, to some degree, but that's my topic today, in a way, the role of similarity here. Now, what does Carnap say about similarity in particular? So here is one quotation again from the 1950 book. Strictly speaking, the question whether the solution is right or wrong makes no sense. The question, so a question about these concepts involved in explication, the question should rather be whether the proposed solution is satisfactory, whether it is more satisfactory than another one, and the like. So satisfactory or more satisfactory instead of right or wrong. So in other words, the explicatum is not judged as what I would call veridical, right or wrong. So it's, to put it slightly differently, it's not a question of the identity of concepts, that the concept you start with and the one you construct in the explication are the same concept. Or put again slightly differently, it's not a matter of synonymy. You don't want, that's not the goal here. This shows clearly that part of the point of the first criterion is exactly to reject that stronger notion of analysis that I pointed to in connection with my alternative 1. So one role for the similarity criterion is exactly that, to move away from this strong notion of analysis. All right. So not the inflationary, realist, strongly metaphysical notion, but or approach, but a deflationary, anti-metaphysical approach fitting with Carnap's overall perspective. And it's a kind of pragmatic pluralism we get. So pragmatic in the sense of the question is it satisfactory? Pluralism in the sense of, is one explicatum more satisfactory than others? And obviously, this is also, as you all know, connected with Carnap's principle of tolerance in his earlier writings on logic or metalogic. So, so that's a first remark about similarity. Now, here is another thing he writes, again from the 1950 book. The explicatum is to be similar to the explicandum in such a way that in most cases in which the explicandum has so far been used, the explicatum can be used. However, close similarity is not required and considerable differences are permitted. So here he goes beyond the deflationary side of it and tells us something a bit more about similarity. Namely, it doesn't have to be close similarity. Differences are permitted. One example that comes up that Carnap mentions in this context is the one I mentioned earlier. he writes, when we compare the explicandum fish with the explicatum piscis, we see that they do not even approximately coincide. And why? Well, dolphins, whales, and so on are included in under the initial concept, but excluded later on. So there can be a difference in terms of what falls under the concept. That's what I take it this example is meant to show. All right. Now let me focus on that a bit more. What's going on here? So now I'm starting to try to get a better sense on explication in this side of it, this aspect of it. So I think the way in which Carnap talks about similarity and that not close similarity isn't required displays what I would call an extensional perspective. So the focus is on cases that do or don't fall under the concept, so that are or aren't part of the extension. So it's allowed that some instances fall under the concept you start with, but not anymore on the one you end up with, or maybe the other way around too. So it seems to me that what's implicit here, or what one could take this to point to, is an extensional notion of meaning or of concepts. So we are primarily working with what's often called concepts in extension. That seems to be what Carnap is working with or pointing to in this connection. And in what follows, I will ask various questions about that, or argue that this is not very satisfactory in some sense. Now, having said that, Carnap is working with an extensional notion, or at least highlighting the extensional aspects here. Is Carnap rejecting intentional notions, including an intentional understanding of meaning or of concepts, maybe like Quine? No, as we all know. In particular, in Meaning and Necessity, one of the very books where he talks about explication, he explores such intentional notions. Namely, as a, I take it, Frege-inspired option, one possible explication of the concept of meaning. So he acknowledges that we can also try to explicate meaning or concepts intentionally. I'm not saying he doesn't acknowledge that at all. But having said that, he does not point to that option in his characterization of explication. There, the comparing the extensions of explicandum and explicatum, comparing the extensions is used as the yardstick. So that's what I'm highlighting so far. Okay. Let me here also quote a remark, or go quickly through a remark about this stage of clarifying the explicandum. Remember, in my several stages, that would be the first stage in doing an explicandum. So here he writes, again from the 1950 book, even though the terms in question are unsystematic, inexact terms, so the ones we start with, there are means for reaching a relatively good mutual understanding as to their intended meaning. An indication of the meaning with the help of some examples for its intended use and other examples for uses not now intended can help the understanding. So this is part of the clarifying the explicandum, the initial step. Notice that, as I understand it, this initial clarification or indication concerns mostly disambiguating what you start with. So it can happen, take the notion of truth, that truth is used in significantly different ways, and you want to focus on truth for propositions or truth for judgments, so the apophantic notion of truth, rather than uses of true like in being a true friend. That's the kind of disambiguation he's pointing to here, right? So we are interested in the case of truth, we're interested in the apophantic notion, in that use of truth. So this initial stage seems to mostly concern that, disambiguation and clarification in putting aside some uses of the term we are talking about. Again, I would say, if you look at this remark, the focus is on extension, the extensional side. So again, he's saying in an explication, they don't need to be identical, only similarity is required or enough overlap. So that's what we get in his explicit remarks when he explains explication, when he introduces or discusses it explicitly. So a first basic point here is then this seems to me pretty vague and not very helpful in itself. Right? But what it's clear is that, in a sense, what he's rejecting, namely the strong metaphysically loaded notion of analysis, what he wants more positively in terms of similarity is only clarified in terms of in extensional terms, in terms of examples and so on, and this idea of disambiguation. Or am I reading Carnap in a way that isn't charitable enough? So far I've pointed to these remarks that involve extensions, an extensional notion of concept. Maybe that's not fair to Carnap, although that's what he's pointing to. In the passages I quoted, he also talks about intended uses. So should one make more of that, the intended uses, not just the cases that fall under it or not? What about the uses? That's where my talk is headed down the line. Okay. Now, so that was a quick reminder about what Carnap says about explication more generally and similarity in particular, at least in his explicit discussion of it. Now let me start comparing what Carnap gives us there, in particular his criteria of adequacy and even more specifically similarity, with what some other people provide us with. The three people I will consider here are Tarski, Nelson Goodman, and Peter Strawson. I think one can look at other figures too. There are a number of figures at the time and later who were talking about, if not explicitly explication, often this is discussed under definitions and conditions of adequacy for definitions. So for example, Karl Menger has a discussion of that early on, and a number of other figures. So eventually I want to look at those figures too, but I'm not going to try to do that today. So there was a debate, what I'm saying is a more general debate about criteria of adequacy for something like analysis, explication, or definition. What about Tarski's case? And remember, Carnap himself points to Tarski as a model for him. Now, the main texts I'm focusing on in this connection are the concept of truth in formalized languages and on the concept of logical consequence. So two writings for the mid-30s or earlier mid-1930s. So what is Tarski doing in those two particular pieces? Well, he's providing analyses, or from Carnap's point of view, explications of, on the one hand, the concept of truth, or maybe more precisely truth in a model. There are some subtle questions about that. And on the other hand, logical consequence, understood in a semantic way, or it's a semantic explication of the notion of logical consequence. So that's the goal. That's what Tarski is, what these articles are meant to provide. Now, how does Tarski talk about criteria of adequacy or desiderata? He explicitly addresses that, and it's actually somewhat surprising that Carnap doesn't point back to that in his discussion of explication. So for Tarski, his criteria of adequacy are divided into two groups in both cases, both for truth and for logical consequence. On the one hand, you have criteria that he calls conditions of formal adequacy, and on the other hand, conditions of material adequacy. Now, let me not go into a detailed discussion of that. Let me just give you a general sense. So in the case of truth, his explication of truth, the main material condition is Tarski's well-known T schema. So for all P is true if and only if P. So that condition has to be satisfied. That has to be captured or preserved. And the main formal condition is consistency, right? Just to give you a bit of a sense. In connection with logical consequence, again, the formal conditions are, I take it, are similar. In terms of the material, the main material condition here is necessary truth preservation. So any explication of logical consequence, it's not a good explication if it doesn't preserve that necessary truth presentation. And then there are some related conditions, validity preserving schematic substitutions and so on. Again, let me not go into the details. But that's the kind of thing Tarski is pointing to. All right. Now, my main point here is, for what's relevant for me, for my discussion, is Tarski is focusing not on cases that fall or don't fall under a concept, but on preserving basic truths or rules or relevant laws or principles. So the way in which Tarski formulates his criteria of adequacy is along those lines. So it's by doing that, by focusing on, by preserving certain rules or laws or something like that, that's meant to preserve the conceptual core about truth or about logical consequence. So that's the kind of similarity, to use Carnap's term, that matters to Tarski in this case. Now, looking at it, so I earlier said that one can look at Carnap's discussion as involving or pointing to an extensional way of thinking about concepts. I think here I would say this points to more of an inferential notion of meaning or of concepts, roughly in Robert Brandam's sense of inferentialism. So he talks about what should be preserved or similar in terms of truths or inferences or corresponding laws or principles. So it's building, of course, on the extensional aspect, and preserving truths already is in some sense extensional, but the focus is now on propositions or judgments or inferences. So what that brings to mind for me is Frege's context principle. Don't ask for the meaning of a word in isolation, but in the context of propositions or judgments or inferences. So implicitly, I take it, that's my suggestion here, one can see Tarski as following that, and thereby working more, not explicitly, but implicitly with an inferential notion of meaning or concept, or focusing on the inferential aspects of it. Also, I would say Tarski's criteria or desiderata are in some ways more explicit and more substantive than what we got in Carnap. Carnap leaves it pretty general. Tarski's criteria are more substantive and specific. For example, they then allow him to prove certain things about truth, because building on these laws or principles and so on. In Tarski's case, the focus is on core notions in metalogic, truth and logical consequence. And the goal here is clearly theory construction in logic or metalogic, right? So that's the context. So I'll be talking more about that side of it too in what follows. That's what I take to be the context and the goal in Tarski's discussion. What I try to highlight is his criteria, and that there's sort of a basic difference in terms of how he approaches them, although they are not unrelated. All right. Let me move on. So that was all I wanted to say about Tarski. Let me move on to Goodman now, and then later on to Strawson. So in Goodman's case, I have in mind three texts in particular: The Structure of Appearance, Languages of Art, and some articles in Fact Fiction Forecast. And again, there's a connection that I want to highlight there. I won't go into many other sides of Goodman's work, but just to focus on this one aspect that's relevant for me. So in Structure of Appearance, Goodman discusses early on in the first few chapters what he calls constructive definitions. So I think you can have in mind something like Frege or Russell on numbers as a constructive definition. A lot of what Carnap talks about in terms of quasi-analysis in the Aufbau, or what Goodman is then trying to do himself in Structure of Appearance. So constructive definitions, and he initially discusses that methodologically in terms of desiderata again, or criteria. Now, I think there are many questions about the relation between Carnap and Goodman, and whether Goodman does justice to Carnap's Aufbau and so on. I'm not going to get into that, those kind of questions, although to some degree they are relevant. I'm just trying to make a more general point about Goodman here. So if you look at Goodman's criteria of adequacy here now for constructive definitions, which I take to be comparable, he's very explicit. Again, it's not meant to be synonymy or what he calls intentional identity, nor extensional identity. Right? So constructive definitions are not meant to preserve intentional identity of meaning or concepts or extensional identity. So far he's in line with Carnap, right? He's rejecting the same things that Carnap is rejecting. Not identity, but only some similarity is required for Carnap. Unlike Carnap, Goodman now points, in particular, that the one thing I want to focus on is on extensional isomorphism. So that's in important cases what he thinks should be, is the requirement, what's crucial to be preserved. So as examples here, well-known examples would be not the one Goodman focuses on, but think again about the Frege-Russell definition of numbers, or think of the usual set-theoretic definition or construction of numbers. What's crucial is that what we get is isomorphic. So the Neumann finite ordinal system is isomorphic. It's meant to be isomorphic to what we start from. There's actually no overlap at all in terms of extension, right? If you take the von Neumann account, we are talking about sets. That's not what we started with. So in this case, what matters is the isomorphism, the overall structure. Why? Well, because in the kind of theory construction, and I should say Goodman, the example he highlights very much along those lines is the definition of geometric points. So he makes that basic point that what matters there is isomorphic, extensional isomorphism in connection with geometric points, but I think it equally applies to constructive definition of numbers. Why is that required? Well, it's because the relevant theory construction often demands exactly that, right? That's what we need in the theory construction. And this, I would say, applies even to some of Carnap's own examples, or at least the kind of examples he points to as paradigms, like the Frege-Russell numbers. So that's the perspective. That's something Goodman adds here, or a further clarification about what may matter in terms of similarity, to use Carnap's terminology. All right. So those were a few remarks about Goodman's structure of appearance. Now I take it that, and I'm here following, I'm very much influenced by work by Catherine Elgin and Georg Brun. I take it that Goodman then, after structure of appearance, in his later writings, moves towards the notion or the method of reflective equilibrium. The term is more, but in terms of talking about criteria of adequacy, that's what he's moving towards. That what we want is what the goal is a kind of reflective equilibrium. That term, of course, is more familiar from John Rawls, but I think, as Georg Brun in particular has made clear, Goodman basically introduced the procedure, the idea here, and influenced Rawls in that connection. So I take it that Goodman himself, maybe not always in those terms, is pointing to a reflective equilibrium as what matters in his later writings. So what's meant by that? Well, it's basically very, very roughly what we should do in terms of desiderata or constraints is balancing the theory construction, the theories we want to get, the theory that comes out of what we are doing, of the constructions, with prior commitments, in particular to earlier cases. So there's meant to be an equilibrium between what we can do theoretically and what we can capture, the earlier kind of cases we can capture. Now, I think one can think of that as, in a sense, a synthesis and further clarification of Carnap's more extensional case-based perspective, at least in his explicit remarks, and Tarski's more inferential theory-oriented perspective. In a sense, one can see the idea of reflective equilibrium building both of those in and trying to combine them in a certain way. That's what I take Goodman to be doing or suggesting. What kind of theory construction is at issue here, since it's very much about the reflective equilibrium? One side is the theory construction. Well, for Carnap and Tarski, we saw it was these metalogical, scientific kind of theory constructions. In Goodman's case, it's philosophical and also, interestingly, aesthetic theory construction. So he gives explication for aesthetic concepts. And if we connect it with Rawls's discussion of reflective equilibrium, we get theory construction in more in ethics or political philosophy. So looking at it in terms of reflective equilibrium lets us cover, so Goodman suggests, I think, all these kind of cases. All right. All right, so that was again a very quick, some very quick remarks about Goodman and how I see what Goodman does, in particular the notion of reflective equilibrium, as relating to what Tarski and what Carnap do. Now let me move on to Strawson, which is maybe more surprising. And here in particular, I have in mind Strawson's his criticism of Carnap in the Schilp volume. So it's called Carnap's Views on Constructed Systems versus Natural Languages in Analytic Philosophy. And what I'm going to say also is connected to some things he says in his later book, Analysis and Metaphysics. So those are the two main texts I have in mind here. How do I see that as related to what I've been talking about so far? Well, in the article in the Schilp volume, here is the basic line of what I take to be Strawson doing basically. He criticizes Carnapian explication as inadequate in a certain sense and suggests to replace it with a different procedure, what he later in Analysis and Metaphysics calls connective analysis. So instead of explicating concepts, he points to giving connective analyses of concepts. Connective analysis is a kind of ordinary language version of analysis. I can say more in the question. I'll say a little bit more in what follows. Now, there has been some discussion of Strawson's criticism of Carnap, and I think the usual take, how people usually, what they say about Strawson's critique is that Strawson accuses Carnap of, quote, changing the subject. So what an explication does, it moves from one concept to a different concept. It changes the subject too much in a way. So by replacing the original concept with a new one, we're changing the subject. And then, so that's noted about Strawson usually. And then I think that criticism or that challenge to Carnap is quickly dismissed often. I don't want to dismiss it that quickly. I think there's more to what's going on in Strawson. In particular, there's something to it that's directly relevant for my discussion. So my interpretation of Strawson is as follows. Here's the first part. So what I take Strawson to be arguing is that Carnap's approach, this explication approach, doesn't solve the philosophical problems that drew us to the concept in the first place. So say we are interested in the concept of truth or the concept of meaning and so on. We were interested in philosophical questions, philosophical problems about those concepts. But by doing and giving an explication, you move away from that and don't really solve those problems. I take it that's the core criticism or one core part of Strawson's account. While he argues his approach does that. Right? That's why he recommends his connective analysis approach over explication. All right. Now, here's a second part to my interpretation, and that connects it more to what I did before. So more basically and crucially, especially for my purposes today, is that Strawsonian connective analysis, the way I interpret what connective analysis is meant to do is it's meant to examine the role of concepts in relevant context and corresponding practices. So that's how I interpret what connective analysis is about. It looks at the contexts in which these concepts were used initially and the corresponding practices. And a connective analysis brings out the role or function the concept plays in those practices. Unlike giving a formal explication. Right? So my suggestion here is parallel again to what I said about Carnap and then Tarski and then Goodman. Strawson implicitly employs what I would call a functional notion of meaning or concept. So what matters about concepts is their function or their role. To explain the meaning of something or to explain a concept is to explain the functional role it plays. And I have in mind, in the back of my mind, and I think Strawson is clearly influenced here by Wittgenstein. So what Wittgenstein sometimes calls the point of a term or concept in a language game. So that's what connective analysis is pointing to, that we should, that it's important to, in terms of clarifying a concept or capturing it, to talk about the function or role it plays. Not just the extension, not just laws, and so on. So along those lines, I take Strawson's core criticism and then alternative suggestion to be, one thing, it's crucial, Strawson argues, even for Carnap himself, if you want to use Carnapian explication, so even if you don't want to replace Carnapian explication by connective analysis, but if you want to stick to Carnapian explication, it's crucial, Strawson is arguing, to consider similarity in terms of function, not in terms of extension, not in terms of the other things we talked about, but in terms of the functional role the concept plays, and also the dissimilarity. So that's what I take to be central to Strawson's account, that's what we need to keep in mind and clarify. What was the function or role of the concept we started with, and how does that compare? How is it similar and also not similar, dissimilar to the functional role the concept we are introducing, the explicatum, is playing? And I think Strawson thinks there's a big shift often. So along those lines, then coming back to the change of subject idea, if you think of concepts or meanings as centrally being constituted by role or function, then there can be a very deep change of subject then in terms of function. That's what I take to be what I take to be interesting in Strawson from my point of view. All right. All right. So I compared Carnap. I talked briefly about Carnap's own remarks about explication, in particular the four criteria and similarity. And I made the point that Carnap is pretty vague about the similarity criterion, especially positively. Now, one may think, and I think myself, that that's partly intentionally so. So he partly, to some degree, intentionally leaves it very general and somewhat vague. Why? Because he doesn't want to restrict the application of explication right away, right? So he wants to present the method of explication in a broad way so that it can be applied in a number of different cases where similarity may play out in different ways. So I do take that to be why Carnap leaves it somewhat general and vague. It's clear what he rejects by focusing on similarity, less so what matters positively, maybe because he wants to leave it more open. Now, coming back to my earlier remarks, I want to say more about it, though, and I think it's important to say more about it. I think I can see why Carnap leaves it pretty open intentionally, but I don't want to. I think one needs to say more about it, or that's what I'm trying to do in this talk. And a first point would be that a purely extensional understanding seems very thin and not very helpful. So what Carnap himself gives us by just pointing to the extensions or not seems not very helpful. For example, it doesn't help for the cases where we want isomorphism, the kind of Hello, there's an echo.
Please can close your mic, please. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Tarski's inferential understanding, or what I take to be inferential suggestions or inferentially guided suggestions, I think add more to it. And Tarski is more explicit also how theory construction is involved here on the explicatum side. And I take Goodman's discussion of reflective equilibrium in a way to synthesize the two. So I presented Tarski and Goodman here as a way of, if one wants to say more about similarity, the positive role, these are steps one could take here. Here is how one could supplement what Carnap himself says about it. In addition, more controversially, I take it, I'm saying Strawson's emphasis on similarity in terms of function adds even more to that. So one could add to Carnap's very general discussion some of these ideas from Tarski, and then discuss it further in terms of Goodman's reflective equilibrium. And then one can also bring in, or should also bring in, questions about function or role along Strawson's lines. I think this is directly relevant for Carnap if you go back to, so arguably this is directly relevant for him. So remember what I quoted earlier, the explicatum is to be similar to the explicandum in such a way that in most cases in which the explicandum has so far been used, the explicatum can be used. So Carnap himself is pointing to uses. He doesn't say much about that, about the kind of the role or function there, explicitly at least not, but it plays a role in his account. Clearly, it's about uses, the use we start from and the use we end up with. And then once that gets highlighted along Strawsonian lines, you immediately get questions about what kind of uses and what kind of functions and how do the functions get preserved or change. That's what I take Strawson to be highlighting. And I think thank you. Now, again, the main use Carnap has in mind, and similar to Tarski and Goodman, consists of scientific or science-inspired theory construction. Right? That seems to be what explication is meant to allow us to do. And again, I take the other three criteria of adequacy to indicate that, to point that out. These are criteria for that kind of thing, clearly relevant for scientific or science-inspired theory construction. Now, one more thing about Carnap. In Carnap's response to Strawson in the Schilp volume, so there's a response to Strawson's article, Carnap actually acknowledges, in some ways he keeps what Strawson says at a distance, wants to keep it at a distance, but he does acknowledge that Strawson's method may help in what he calls clarifying the explicandum. So he is to some degree aware that that's where it could play a role along the lines of what I'm saying. But to me, it looks like, at least in terms of what he explicitly says, what Carnap explicitly says, he isn't seeing Strawson's main point in that connection, what I take to be the main point, that what matters is the function of the explicandum and the explicatum, that's what we need to, it's really crucial. For Carnap, that's just part of clarifying the explicandum, which is sort of a small aspect of explication. For Strawson, this is absolutely central, I take it. Now, one can put this as this is not meant necessarily as a rejecting Carnapian explication. I think one can think of that, what I'm suggesting here, as a friendly amendment along the lines of Carnap's acknowledgement in the Schilp volume. So one can and should supplement explication along such lines. One should really focus and play up this question of function or role, both on the explicandum and explicatum side. This includes studying how and why such functions can and often do change, how they can be specified more or generalized or modified, and so on. I take it that a number of different things like that can happen in an explication. It can lead to a specification, can lead to a generalization, it can lead to other modifications of the function. Depends on the case, I take it. In some of Carnap's examples, it leads to a specification, a further narrowing down, but I'm not sure that's necessarily part of an explication. Now, the point I'm making here is not really entirely original. I take it that some recent proponents of what's called pragmatic genealogy have made exactly the point I'm making here. So I'm making it in terms of Strawson, but if you look at, I have in mind people like Katarina Dutil-Noves and Mathieu Queloz, in their discussions of pragmatic genealogy, and Katarina in particular connects it directly to Carnapian Explication in some of her writings, they suggest to do that, to supplement Carnapian Explication exactly that way, by really taking seriously this question about function or role. They go even further than Strawson by adding a historical dimension to the study of these functions. So a central point of a pragmatic genealogy is to study these questions about functions and roles historically, and exactly the changes over time. And I'm with them, as you can tell from my talk here. All right? I'm doing something like that too. Okay, so let's see how much. I still have a little bit of time left, I take it.
Oh, yeah, I think you can have an hour, even if we started a bit late. So
right. Okay.
We may cut some Q&A, but we will see.
Yeah, there are a few more slides I have. And
perfect.
Since we started late. Okay, so what am I doing? I'm saying by enriching the understanding of similarity first along Tarski's and Goodman's lines, the vague initial discussion in Carnap becomes more substantive, and that's important for certain purposes. I can see why Carnap himself doesn't do it, but I think for various purposes this is helpful or a good thing. But one can and should go further than what we saw in Tarski and Goodman, and bring in something like Strawsonian connective analysis of pragmatic genealogy to supplement what Carnap is doing. I think, so I'm suggesting that for Carnap himself, I'm suggesting the same thing for current philosophy. I think in a lot of current formal philosophy, to some degree also in conceptual engineering, this is a crucial side that I would like to see more, in a way, the focus on function and changes in function and so on. Now, one more remark about Carnap. To be charitable to Carnap, so what did I do? I started with Carnap's explicit remarks about explication, and that he doesn't say very much about a similarity in a positive way. It's clear what he means negatively. Now, perhaps quite a bit of what I said, so some of these points in Tarski, in Goodman, and maybe even in Strawson, are implicit in Carnap's own treatment of cases. So in his discussion of probability, when you look there at how he does clarification of the explicandum, arguably he's doing some of the things I'm pointing to that he should be doing. He just isn't highlighting it in his discussion of similarity. So maybe, and again, I think it's compatible with what Carnap wants to do. But along those lines, I think a new challenge arises, but this is basically against Strawson's challenge. The point then is, does explication not often lead to significant shifts in function? So for example, we shift from an ordinary or from an earlier philosophical use of the concepts where it plays certain functions to scientific theory building and the function of the explicandum in that. So remember the move from fish as an ordinary concept, it plays a certain role in ordinary discussions, to the zoological, more scientific notion, where we have different goals and it plays a different role, the concept there, a more scientific, systematic role. Once one realizes that, again, I take it this is one of Strawson's basic points. Strawson is right that Carnap is potentially and often actually bypassing and not solving the original what happened in the original side, the original, in particular, the philosophical side, and the function of the concept there. That's the new challenge. Okay. Now again, I think this is to some degree intentional on Carnap's side. I think part of his project overall is, again, to assimilate philosophy to science, and that exactly includes turning philosophical questions into scientific ones. So I take it the basic attitude there is forget about the old problems, refocus on the new ones, right? The explicatum allows us to ask new questions, maybe more precise questions and so on, focus on those, forget about the old problems. That's part of the whole move, I take it, what Carnapian Explication is meant to do. But why, that leads to an even bigger question, why do that? What's the advantage of focusing on the new one? What's the larger purpose? Well, scientific theory building, but what's the purpose of that? What kind of conceptual engineering, what's the goal there? I think that's the big question in the background. And let me just say very briefly, I think there are some answers that have been suggested in that connection. Very strong one, interesting one, substantive one, I take it to come from André Karras. So he takes it that the big goal in moving philosophy in the scientific direction and employing explication in it is to lead to a new form of enlightenment. So it's meant to have strong consequences along those lines. So that's why we want to leave behind the old problems and move to the new ones. Alan Richardson has suggested a different, more modest one where he connects explication with metrology. So a more sort of narrowly, I take it, conceptual engineering kind of view. But that's the question then in the background that my discussion leads to. Having said that, I do think that often when people use explication, both in earlier cases and now today, claims remain that the old philosophical questions haven't just been left behind, but that they have been solved to some degree, explicitly or implicitly. So I think, take Tarski, he's claiming that his explication of truth is solving some older philosophical questions about truth. So it's not just totally to leave behind the old concept. It is supposedly meant to solve some questions. One can take Frege's discussion of number along those lines too. It's meant to solve or answer some earlier philosophical questions. But to what degree is that defensible if the functions have changed so strongly? That's the question I think we are led to here. I take that to be a significant philosophical question. In a way, that's what I'm highlighting in the whole talk. I take it as that's a significant question, and one that I don't see as having been addressed very much yet in the literature. I'm sure there are some exceptions. So how does this explication answer, if at all, the earlier questions, philosophical questions we started with? To what degree or in which way? And that involves, answering that question, I think involves being really careful about the function the concept played in the earlier context and the function they play and the shift in function they play. Does the shift in function really make it plausible to say that we have solved the earlier philosophical problem or not? All right. Okay, so what have I done? This is my last two slides. What was my goal today? I've put Carnap's remarks on explication from the late 40s and early 50s, first into the context of similar remarks by Tarski, by Nelson Goodman, and by Peter Strawson, to say something about the similarity criterion. That was sort of my overall theme. Now you may ask, what about the earlier Carnap? How are his relations of quasi-analysis and rational reconstruction related to what I've been saying? I don't really have a developed position on this topic. I have some general ideas. I do take it that rational reconstruction is somehow close to explication, although there may also be some interesting differences. I'm assuming some people in the audience have substantive views about that connection, and I'd be curious about it. I also take it that Katharina's work is very much addressing that issue. I think what I said earlier about explication differs a little bit to your discussion of how rational reconstruction and explication relate to each other, but I find that an interesting issue to address. What I suggested, so I brought in Tarski, Goodman, and Strawson, but I'm very much aware that I've only sketched Tarski, Goodman, or Strawson very, very roughly, or in a rough and ready way. That a lot more would need to be said about them, but I only had so much time. In connection with Goodman, I would point people to, again, Catherine Elgin and Georg Brunn's writings about Goodman and explication and reflective equilibrium. They've already explored that to some degree. I'm planning to work more on Strawson in that connection. So I gave you a very rough sketch of my view in that connection. I'm planning to work that. I'm aware that this needs to be spelled out in much more detail. Now, in addition, one could also bring some other figures. So I brought in Tarski, Goodman, Strawson. What about Quine? What about Hempel? And also looking forward, how do these things play out in these figures? Do they discuss these criteria in a similar way? I think Quine does it less, as far as I'm aware. Hempel too. Who else could one bring in here? I pointed to, say, Karl Mengel, for example, as someone else to look at. I think that would be a next step. Or maybe I'm not aware, maybe in some current formal philosophy, people have really addressed the issue I brought up. I'm only aware about discussions of formal philosophy to some degree. So if that's the case, I would be very thankful for references. Okay, I'm almost done. Now, my talk is meant to be, or in terms of becoming a paper, to be, I see it as part of a philosophical history of Carnapian explication. So Carnap talks about explication. I brought in Frege, Russell, Tarski. I brought in Goodman, Strawson. I hinted at Quine, Hempel. So I see this as a part of a general project where we look at these figures and compare what they say about explication or explication-related things, and in particular about criteria of adequacy. The core of my talk was to argue that both Carnapian explication itself and a philosophical historical study of it should involve questions about functions or roles, so should involve functional or genealogical investigations. I think that would enrich things and allow us to answer certain questions. I see that as far as I'm aware, missing. Again, there are probably some exceptions. So, yeah, so it's the functions of concepts in shifting context that I'm suggesting needs more attention. It seems to me that these functions themselves often shift in those connections. And how does that happen? Why? And what's the effect of that? I think that's what I'm pointing to. So as you can tell from that, my own notion of concept or meaning that in the back of my mind is a functional one, and in fact a genealogical one. So I'm clearly influenced by Wittgenstein and Strawson in that connection, but I'm trying to use it to do something constructive in connection with Carnapian explication. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Erich. Quite a remarkably rich and stimulating talk. And now, as usually, we have a 5 minutes break, and it's 10:53, so we resume at 10:59. So 5 minutes break, and then we have a Q&A. See. Messages, so raise your hand. Okay, okay, I have here all the people who have already raised their hands. Can too. Let me see. Hi, Ken, can you hear me? Let me see. Okay, so you wanted me to read your questions for you? I'll figure it out. Yeah, very rich talk, Eric. Very stimulating and so interesting.
Thank you. Maybe a bit too sweeping.
I am fine with that, but you touch on several issues that I'm also working on and very interested in. So
Okay. Yeah, there may be more discussion in the literature on the topics I talked about than I'm aware. So I'm hoping people will point me to those. Is there a problem with the echo?
I don't hear the echo. So when you talk, I hear you fine.
Okay.
I don't have any problem with that. So I will give. We have 4 questions, and then I would like also to read the comments or comments/questions of Kenneth Westphal, who has issues with the microphone, but he wrote. I don't know if you can see his message in call messages, but I will read it. Yes. Oh, we have a lot of questions.
I think, Luca, we can, because we started at 4:45 Rome time, we can reach 5:45 Rome time.
I think we can we can do this if you agree. So we can officially end at when is the right time. So with this we started at 9:30, so 11:30, and then we can continue. So if people want to stay, and we can continue to move on. The recording can go on without any problem. That maybe some people have scheduled these 2 hours and then they move to something else. So
Yes, but yeah, sure.
oh, you lower your hand, Katerina?
No, I wouldn't. Sorry. So
Keep your
yeah,
okay.
yeah, keep it. Sorry. Thanks.
Keep it. All right. Okay, so it's 10:59, so 5 minutes past. I hope you had the chance to get a coffee or relax a bit, and we can start immediately with the questions. So the first in line is David Stump. So please.
Thank you. Well, Eric, that was a very helpful talk. So it was very clear, and that raised a lot of issues. But on the last point you make about dealing with the original philosophical question that gets replaced, surely there are some philosophical problems that we want to move past and say were pseudo problems or the way we go forward is by making by changing the subject, or that finding a different way around the topic. And I've been working on theories of truth recently, and just as using that as an example, rather than give a substantial definition of truth, which would seem to involve a lot of metaphysics and what makes a sentence true and things like that, the deflationary accounts and pragmatic accounts want to give an account of the use of the word true and the use of the word truth in our ordinary discourse. And that is changing the subject, but it's giving an answer that's an answer we can give, and it's related in some way. I guess my question for you is, how do we know when we've done enough to answer the original concerns without falling into, endless disputes over metaphysics that we can't answer? So,
Okay. Thanks for that point or that question. I think it's clearly part of what's driving Carnap and other users of explication is that they think earlier problems were pseudo problems and we want to move beyond them. So that's clearly part of what's going on here, or what's driving this. But sometimes that seems to me to be done too quickly in a way. And for example, often the thing to move away, the pseudo problems, are these very metaphysically loaded kind of, it comes from a perspective like that. And that's rejected, and that's what's made explicit in this with the similarity criterion. And we want to move on to more tractable scientific problems or something like that. But part of what I'm saying is that's not the only alternative. We don't have to think about these earlier problems in terms of ways. Maybe partly they have been talked about that way, and we want to move away from that. But we can also reconsider some of that along Strawsonian connective analysis lines, we can and should reconsider these initial problems in terms of the role the concepts and so on played earlier on, and how much of that we want to preserve and so on. Now, I take it you are saying that's what you're doing already in some of those studies. Then I think you are in line with what I'm suggesting. All I'm suggesting is, in a way, a certain way of how one can do that, namely by studying the use in terms of the role or function of these terms along Strawson's lines, and maybe with a historical dimension added, so along pragmatic genealogical ways. I take that to be a fruitful, insightful way of doing it. The questions are always, it's hard to give a final answer in those connections. I think when you do that, it always opens up even more in a certain sense. So I don't think this leads to easy answers, but it gives you a way of approaching those issues.
Okay, so now we follow the line. Thomas Huber.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. My question probably is going to be along the line of David, so I may repeat it just a little bit. I was going to start out slightly provocatively by wondering whether your concern that Carnapian explication leaves out the philosophical problems, whether that doesn't push us back to the substantive notion of analysis, and that, of course, makes us all shudder deep in our bones. So we don't want to do that. So, given that, I'm wondering whether, because I think what you suggested about looking at the function and stuff, what you get out of Strawson, I would tend to agree with you that a lot of that seems to be already implicit in Carnap. When you take this very first use he made of it with the two concepts of probability, I think he distinguished those two precisely with regard to the two explications he had there with regard to the different functions they played. So this is going. So in response then, might Carnap then sort of say, well, look, yes, and that would be an elaboration of an attempted answer to the question, well, don't be too quick with the philosophical pseudo problems, would be that he could say, well, look, whether they're pseudo problems or not, they're problems which we have struggled with forever without ever coming up with anything good. Rather, what we should do with these explications is look at the functions that these concepts do and develop these explications as you outlined, and then compare them. Well, and assess, well, which of these functions do we want to pursue? Which ones does it make sense to want to use concepts for? And which ones, well, fall by the wayside, etc. So I don't know, how do you see this reading of what you've been saying?
Yeah, so one thing I thought I need to do is look again at Carnap's own cases in more detail, like probability and so on. And actually also I need to look more at his diary and what he says about things in that connection. But yeah, my sense is that probably quite a bit of what I'm suggesting is implicit there already. And as I mentioned, he does acknowledge that Strawsonian connective analysis may be helpful. So he's aware of that, and maybe he's doing some of that himself. But that's not often emphasized in general discussions of explication. That's sort of what I'm trying to push at, including in current formal philosophy.
Okay.
So I would want to say, yeah, do more of that explicitly in a way. That would be interesting philosophically. Now, another response. Yes, we don't want to move back to the earlier substantive metaphysical notions or something like that, but that's not the only option here. That's another thing I'm always unhappy with. For one thing, the earlier metaphysical discussions weren't all unfruitful or not important. I'm convinced that some metaphysical debates in science play actually an important role, and it's not helpful to totally try to eliminate those. But even apart from that, there aren't just the two options of this strong metaphysically loaded analysis and the totally deflationary Carnapian explication. There's the Strawsonian pragmatic genealogical approach, and there may be other approaches too.
Well, okay, well, fine. Yeah, I would say the functional analysis is part of the Carnapian one, but that. Yeah, so that. But thank you for your answer and your talk. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. Insofar as that's the case, that I'm happy in a sense, and my goal would be more to bring that out and to provide tools for bringing that out.
That's right. Good. Thank you.
Okay, so we move to the next question by Andrea Sereni. Oh, it seems that Andrea is not here anymore, or
No, I'm here. I'm here.
oh,
Sorry,
perfect.
I had my microphone off. Sorry, I'm sorry. Hi, thanks, and thanks, Eric, for the wonderful talk. I think it's probably again possibly a follow up from the previous question. I wanted to focus a little more on the distinction between analysis and explication that captures my interests. And there seems to be an issue at the beginning of your talk. You seem to stress the role that the criterion, among others, the criterion of similarity plays in Carnap to distinguish explication from analysis. Now, I was wondering whether you could say something more about that, because there's a sense in which all the examples that you've given of possibilities of cashing out explication furthermore, so through Goodman and Tarski and so on, they are all ways of, in different senses, with different degrees of dynamicity, if you want, but they are all sensitive to, it seems to me, to capture a unique notion or a unique role or a unique materially adequate notion or interpretation. And on the other hand, if you look at what could be paradigmatic cases of philosophical analysis like Frege, Frege was well aware that he was letting go some of the uses that we have. So when he has the discussion between the adjectival and the substantival role, he's perfectly aware that, yes, there are things that we say and that we must let go. So this role of similarity, and whether it is strict similarity and it is looser similarities and so on, it seems to me to be present both in explication and in analysis. What it really seems to be different is the distinction between the aim, apart from the metaphysical burden that you discussed with the previous questions, but what seems to me really different is whether the analysis is meant to be univocal. So we want to capture just one notion, probably in an hermeneutical way. So the notion that we didn't know, but we've been using all along. And on the other end, whether the analysis is going to be pluralistic, so explication, there is no right or wrong, and so on and so forth. So I was wondering, what is the real enemy here, whether it is explication or whether it is monism, as one might say.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thanks. So I can see that in earlier uses of a stronger notion of analysis, some kind of that arguably one also is giving up certain things, that it's a kind of similarity rather than identity or something like that. Although I mean, Frege's case is complicated, and you are suggesting a stronger reading of Frege. Carnap would give an explication reading of Frege. It's one of his main examples, actually. So there's a question: what's the right reading of Frege? Now, insofar as Frege is trying to answer earlier questions, like about the epistemological status of arithmetic and so on, that would point in the analysis direction, maybe. I actually think in Frege there are aspects of both in a certain sense, but apart from that, yeah, that's interesting. That analysis is usually, if you think of analysis in terms of, in particular, necessary and sufficient conditions, it seems to be assumed that there's a correct one way of analyzing, while in explication that's clearly given up. So it's the move from a monist to a pluralist one. That's clearly an important part of it. So I'm glad that you highlighted that in a way. I would then, as a next step, say that's connected with, in explication, the different options, they can play different functions and so on. So explication then, if you read it in this pluralist pragmatic way, leads to the question, what's the function it's meant to play? And it can be different ones. It can be more scientific ones. It can be more ordinary ones and so on. That's the side of it I was exploring in a way. While in analysis, I don't see that as being addressed very much usually, but maybe that's what you would challenge also. Also,
yeah, I don't know. I would have to think about it. No, you're right. There's an aspect of either methodological pluralism or contextualism problem or aim-related choice
right.
that is usually absent in analysis, and I would totally agree with that. And then I would see probably not the again. I would take the big distinction between the two, not to be how much similar is the notion, the explicatum to the explicandum, but the fact that explicata can be many, whereas analysatum or whatever, analyzata is just one. Yeah, that would probably is where I would locate the difference.
Yeah. No, I find that helpful. So, one way to think about it is that in these stronger senses of analysis, implicitly some context or some function is assumed. They are one of them.
Yeah.
And it would then be interesting to bring out which one and so on.
Yeah.
On my lines. Well, that's given up or opened up along explication lines.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so we move on. Rick Crete is the next one.
Thanks, Eric. I really enjoyed that talk. And I'm not quite sure how much I agree or disagree with what you're doing, but I want to explore you gave a quote from Carnap. I think it was on slide 17 or 18, but please do not go back trying to find the slides and so on. You talk about, Carnap talks about explication as preserving the uses of the concepts in question. And you read that as the sort of narrowly extensional uses of a concept, and recommend that we also take into account the inferential uses or the functional uses and so on. And I couldn't agree more. It's just that I think that Carnap has already been thinking about that. For example, in section 4 of logical syntax, he takes the presentation of a language and turns it on its head. The usual presentation begins with, oh, okay, what are the terms and the sentences and so on, and builds up the inferential rules, so to speak. And there, he begins with the direct consequence relation and suggests that everything that could be said about a language could be done in terms of the direct consequence relation. Now, that's an inferential approach on steroids. It's very much in terms of what follows from what and so on. And I think part of the problem is that original phrase, tell me how it's being used and preserve the uses. There are uses of an extensional sort, and there are also functional uses, inferential uses, and that different terms may be different with respect to whether one or the other is salient in the understanding of the concept. I would think that mathematical terms and logical terms are almost entirely about their inferential role. And I think that's probably true of high-level theory in whatever empirical science as well, although that has to be tied down to a certain extent to observation, whereas observational concepts probably have more to do with, okay, when do we apply them, and in their extensional uses. So at that level, it's the extensional stuff that's salient. At the high level theoretical level and the mathematical level and logic and so on. Now that is their inferential uses. And likewise with the probability stuff in the context of which he's presenting his most extended discussion of explication. So I think, in a way, not saying what kind of uses he had in mind was deliberate to include both, and it could depend on the individual concept, whether one or the other is more important. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, thanks very much. No, I agree with a lot of that. I mean, to one thing, you've explained a bit more to me why Carnap talks about the fish example the way he does, right? That's the observational scientific case where the extension matters and so on. And so maybe I was focusing too much on that one example and then attributing this purely extensional way of thinking about it to Carnap. But that's it. Sometimes I feel like I'm just too following Carnap's explicit remarks too closely in a way. But if I look at the applications and so on, it's much richer, but I should look more at that in a way. Several of you are pointing me in that direction. Now, I take it that, one or two more remarks. I take it that often the extensional, the inferential, and the functional are connected, that it's a matter of all of them. And so I agree that in some cases, one is more the main thing, and in other cases, another one. Maybe along your lines that in mathematics, it's often the functional inferential, especially the inferential, and in other cases. So that would be interesting to explore further. Is there a systematic difference in the different kind of cases we are dealing with here? Yeah, and I take it that part of Nelson Goodman's move to reflective equilibrium is to say we need to look at the connection between them, the extensional and the inferential theoretical one. We need to play them off against each other. Yes. Yeah, I'm not sure how much that answered the question.
But that is helpful, but I would like, you don't have to do it now, but I would like some time to pick your brain about your reactions to part 4 of logical syntax.
Yeah.
I think that is intended to generalize onto semantics and so on, looking back on it, but he's not yet ready to do that. So that there is a thoroughly inferential role semantics in the offing if you take that as a model. But please, I'm not trying to insist on that sort of thing now.
Well, that sort of points in the direction. So this you put your finger on an interesting question about the development of Carnap's use. I would say here, maybe that's true in logical syntax. I really want to look now at it. Now, how is that related? How does that develop into the meaning and necessity discussions and so on? So there are then interesting questions about how exactly that comes up and gets developed in Carnap's use in those writings. I think that would be really interesting to look at more. Yeah. And I take your word that it's in logical syntax, it's very much inferential. I'll look at that some more.
Okay, so if there isn't any follow-up, we can go to the next question. So Mirko Sambrotta.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you very well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was very enlightening. I really enjoyed the talk. And my question goes somehow in the same direction. I really like you're pointing to function, to Strawson function. And my question is, one way, the relevant question is how we can understand this function or this role. Of course, the natural answer is they can be understood as inferential role, right? And in line with Tarski, or even better with Brandom. But if we endorse also an holistic view, as Brandom does, for instance, in the end, the function or the inferential rule of explicandum and explicata turn out to be totally different. So the question of similarity is still there. To what extent we can still talk about shifting of one function or one inferential rule to the other, and still talking about explication. Or to what extent we can still talk about changing of a concept of inferential rule instead of shifting the subject matter completely. And my tentative question or answer or proposal is, as you are an expert of Wittgenstein, why is it isn't this exactly the problem of following rule? The rule following problem in Wittgenstein. To what extent the pupil can be said to make the mistake in following a rule instead of changing completely a rule and following another rule? Isn't that the same problem? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, the last is a bigger question. Yeah, I think there is the question how, so I pointed to the importance of studying the role or the function of terms or concepts. And then there is the question how to study that. And there are several different proposals in that connection. So I take it an inferential approach would be one approach to that. So focusing on the inferential function. I take it in Wittgenstein and Strawson, they would point to a practice-based function, something like that. So the underlying practices, forms of life, to use Wittgenstein's term, language games and so on, and the role that plays. And now that's a rich topic in itself, but it's somewhat different from an inferential approach. And I was pointing more in that direction. And then yet another way of studying it is more genealogical. Now that can be combined with the functional. So I take it in pragmatic genealogy, that's what's happening. It's a combination of a functional approach and a historical, how did the function change over time and so on, approach. About the relation to the rule, I mean, clearly there's a connection to Wittgenstein, I think. But I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I take it Wittgenstein is saying don't look, part of what he's saying is don't try to find rules, explicit or underlying rules or something like that. Look at the practices and the habits and so on of people's in the practices. So that that's the suggestion he's making. And that's what he himself then is doing, describing. So I take these language games to be descriptions of simplified kind of practices that are meant to reveal something about the concepts and so on. Yeah, I feel like I haven't fully answered your question about the rule following debate. Do you want to follow up?
No, it's fine. It's fine. Just a matter of just a thought. I will also, because I'm interested in this connection actually, and I don't know the answer, and I'm really curious. But it's not maybe then it's not the stage to answer this question. It was a proposal to a possible investigation.
Okay.
To the similarity between rule following problem and exactly explication in Carnap.
I'll think about it more. Yes.
Okay, so then we can move to the next question that comes from Lassi Sario Ramsey.
Hello. Thanks for an inspiring talk. I'm particularly interested in what you say about Tarski's definitions of truth and logical consequence, and whether they are Carnapian explications, because I have written a paper on this very topic. And in the literature, I think some people call these definitions analysis, and some people call them explications. And I agree with you that this difference is not emphasized enough. But then there are some people like John Etchemendy who very clearly argue that Tarski's definition of logical consequence is a conceptual analysis. And also in a more recent book, and perhaps a more historically informed book, Douglas Patterson seems to suggest that it is indeed a conceptual analysis. So I would very much like to hear what kind of arguments do you have in mind when you seem to take it for granted that Tarski is proposing explications and not analysis or something else?
Yeah, okay, thank you. I did mention at the end that I was very quick about these figures, and that definitely applies to Tarski, as you are bringing out. I only sketched basically, I just followed Carnap himself looking at Tarski on truth as an example of explication. So Carnap himself clearly wanted to see it that way, and mentioned it as an inspiring example. Then there's the question, is that defensible in the end, or is it more of a stronger sense of analysis? I definitely see some aspects of Carnapian explication in what Tarski is doing. For example, he's also giving up. It seems pretty. He's arguing with his criteria of adequacy that certain things, the conceptual core or something like that, should be preserved, but not other things. That seems a step in the Carnapian direction. And I take it he would also, I would have to look more, but the pluralistic side I take to be there in Tarski too, that there isn't just one option, we could explore several different options and so on. So those would be aspects that are pointing in the explication direction, but one would have to really look in detail at Tarski and that connection. And I'd be curious to see how you are looking at that. I mean, it is true that, as far as I can tell in Tarski, that he wants to preserve some conceptual core. So there is in that sense, an element of analysis there. And he is also saying he's answering earlier philosophical questions by doing that. So that points in the direction of a stronger sense of analysis. I'm a bit worried that with Etchemendy and other people, we are moving too far to the very strong sense of analysis. That seems, there are questions about that in itself, and I find to read Tarski fully that way, I find unconvincing at this point. But I would like to see arguments about it, why one might argue that.
Yeah. Thanks. In my paper, I actually argue that we should take these definitions to be explications, especially the one about logical consequence. Yeah. So I agree with you on that.
Yeah, I mean, I take it, for example, I haven't looked in great detail at Etchemendy's criticism of Tarski, for example, on logical consequence, but there seems to be an appeal to an intuitive notion of logical consequence that seems to point to a very strong notion of analysis. We're trying to capture that intuitive sense of logical consequence, and that seems in conflict with explication idea. It seems, yeah, it seems to push it pretty far back. And again, that I find it frustrating in a way, or unsatisfactory, that question, how far are we back to that, to this very strong notion of analysis, or how far are we on the explication side, is sometimes a bit ignored still, but maybe in your work and this related work, it's starting to be addressed.
Okay, so we have another question from Caterina Del Sordo, and then we have some remarks, long remarks from Kenneth Westphal. We are going to do all this if Erich is so kind to stay with us a little bit longer, because it's 11:30, so we were supposed to close to end at this time, but if you still have some minutes, we can move on. So, but allow me to, since the time is over, and we will continue this conversation, but allow me to say a few things, because I'm sure that some of our people in the audience had to leave, that we will continue this webinar on Carnap on March 20 with the talk of Georg Schimmer from Hilbert's program to Carnap's Wissenschaftslogik. And I want to thank my co-organizers, so Caterina Del Sordo and Silvano Zippoli-Caiani, to be here with me and to be here also the next time. And now that we have made our conclusive remarks, we can move on extra time. And I welcome the next question from Caterina herself.
Hi, thanks. Many thanks, Erich, for this very rich contribution. I basically have two observations. The first is on formal philosophy, and I wanted to stimulate on a passage from Hannes Leitgeb in a paper from 2013, where it is, I think, in the journal Metaphilosophy or something similar. And there he commented on the change of the subtitle of the journal Erkenntnis from International Journal of Analytic Philosophy to International Journal of Scientific Philosophy. And it is interesting, I think, that there he strongly apply the idea of explication. But it is also interesting that he does not get rid of philosophical problems. So he considered scientific methods and philosophical problems as such, namely the traditional ones: consciousness, knowledge in general, ethics, and so forth and so on. So, and there he it seems that in that case, deflationism has to do not with what we are focusing on, but rather on which are the methods we apply, regardless of if whether we apply them on traditional philosophical problems or not. So I wanted just to stimulate a comment about this point that or this view that Leitgeb made in this 2013 paper, which we can consider a paradigmatic case of formal philosophy in the sense of mathematical philosophy. So there we don't get rid of philosophical problems. We just approach them with different methods that we import from science. So what is deflationism here? Has to do with methods, I would say, not with the problem we address. So this was the first comment. And the second comment is rather an ongoing comment of mine. And I think that according to evaluating the criteria of adequacy of explication, the case of Aufbau is really interesting, because there, I guess, we find at least two models that you were illustrating, namely the Tarskian one and the late Carnapian one, because if we look at the fact that Carnap wants to sort of give a logical reconstruction of our cognitive process, then in that case we can say that it is a case of loose similarity. He never committed to a strong identity between the rational reconstruction of cognitive process and the cognitive process itself. So there we find the Carnapian model, namely the loose idea of similarity. But then if we stick to quasi-analysis and rational reconstruction in terms of mathematical tool, there we find, I think, a more solid criteria of adequacy that maybe can be considered as an inferential one. But at least I wanted to highlight that maybe Aufbau is an interesting case, because I think it features at least two of the models you were mentioning for the criteria of adequacy. And although I don't know, maybe the stronger part, that of quasi-analysis, could be evaluated according to a more Tarskian approach. These were my comments. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. About the second one, so that I should really look at Aufbau more with those questions in mind, and that sounds quite interesting that one can find those two sides there. I mean, my general sense, without having studied it carefully enough, is that sometimes appeals to rational reconstruction are close to appeals to what he would later call explication. Well, maybe quasi-analysis brings in something else. maybe it's interesting that you're suggesting more an inferential way of thinking, or I mean, in some of the literature, it's also a sort of a structuralist way of thinking, structuralist construction or something like that.
At least among the three models you were mentioning, maybe the Tarskian one is the one that I would consider as more fitting with the Aufbau model. But this is thanks.
Right. So I wish I had more to say about the Aufbau, but I'm curious to see more of what you are developing in that connection, or other people. About your first point, so I do see Hannes Leitgeb as one of the main representatives of this Carnapian explication form of philosophy approach today. I mean, he explicitly refers back to Carnap and so on. There's a question, how close is he to the historical Carnap? But he certainly thinks he is in many ways. And I need to look at that paper you mentioned. So from my point of view, then I would have two reactions to what you presented him as doing in that article. One is, so he's saying, yeah, it's a matter of choosing the methods. I think I agree with that. I mean, that's part of what I'm saying too. But I would be maybe more than he be worried or have the question whether changing the methods then brings with it changing the problems. He seems to think you can change the method and still address the same problems. That's what I'm calling into question in a way, or what I'm saying one should look at that carefully.
Yeah, I don't think he's explicit in this respect, but at least he didn't cut off any traditional problem from the so this was there are no pseudo problems in a way. There are only fruitful or not fruitful methods there, apparently, at least. Very tolerant attitude, I would say, as a Carnapian.
Yeah, I mean, my as I've argued in earlier papers on Carnapian explication, my perspective is maybe in line with that. Then, that for certain problems, the formal method that's primarily described in, well, I take it explication can take a very formal form, formal mathematical logical form, but also a broader, more scientific use of broader scientific methods forms. So those would be, for some problems, those seem clearly fruitful and good methods, but maybe not for all problems in philosophy. For some problems, the connective analysis that Strawson is proposing is arguably more fruitful. It depends on the subject matter you are dealing with, I think. But it sounds like he's acknowledging that to some degree, that a plurality of methods, it's good to have a plurality of methods, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
And also, sure. No, I think also in that paper you have a plurality, because although he didn't look at maybe what you were interested in I think the 2024 paper which is in the volume Interpreting Carnap, where you look also at the theory of art for instance. So in that paper we don't have this kind of ideas, but however you have at least several kind of scientific methods, from the mathematical one, the experimental one, and the computational one. So maybe one is open to consider scientific method in a broad sense, I would say, and still having maybe a Carnapian approach in a sense of being somehow a deflated view of philosophical problems. Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, one interesting thing about Goodman is that he is applying it explicitly to aesthetic concept. And then if you agree that Rawls is influenced by Carnap and in the same vicinity here, then you get applications in ethics and political philosophy. And the question there, are these more mathematical or empirical methods? How fruitful are they there? comes up then. Anyway. Maybe one more point. Maybe so in my past writings, I made that point already, or tried to make that point. Today, I'm partly doing that, but I'm doing something slightly different. I'm arguing that the explication method and something like a connective analysis or pragmatic genealogy method could be combined fruitfully. Not that they're alternative methods, but they could be combined.
Okay, I understand.
Okay,
Thanks.
so we already sorry. It's already 11:44. We have other two questions somehow, and I want to also to ask something, but if we go really too late with the time, so I can skip it. But now I want you to address the remarks of Kenneth Westphal. I don't know if you can read them in the in-call messages. If you cannot, I read it for you.
Yeah, if you could read them.
Sure. He raises 2 points. So the number one, well, actually 3 points. So the number one says, I agree entirely that the contrast between conceptual analysis and conceptual explication is disregarded. Also widely neglected is Carnap's express emphatic point that all his logical syntax and later also his logical semantics, both extensional and intentional, is all empty formalism unless and until these logical constructions are closely linked to some actual scientific theory or field. The second remark is that Carnap's uses are within the linguistic frameworks ESO linked to scientific theory or theories LSS. Explications can, and I think he believes, typically do pertain to the key terms or concepts within a linguistic framework, so that improved use of an explicated term or concept improves the use and functioning of that linguistic framework, which can improve also the relevant scientific usage of terms or frameworks theories. Then there is another one, which is such results can show that some putative philosophical problem is a pseudo problem.
Yeah, I think the pseudo problem question I already addressed at the very beginning. So I think, yeah, it can turn out that an earlier problem, we might reach the conclusion that an earlier problem is a pseudo problem, or we want to change it or something like that. But I don't think that's always happening, and so focusing on using a functional kind of maybe combined with a maybe inferential approach could be a useful way of considering questions like that along those lines, whether we were dealing with pseudo problems or not is sort of part of what I'm saying. I'm not quite sure what the question before that was, but so it mentions linguistic frameworks. And yeah, I've been focusing on explication as a way of dealing with concepts, particular concepts, as Carnap himself does. But I take it that these concepts are always, or one should always see explication as part, we're working within linguistic frameworks there. So I see a close connection between the discussion of explication and what Carnap does in semantics, empiricism, semantics, and ontology in terms of frameworks. So concepts occur within frameworks. And then what I would, the question I was highlighting today is, what's the framework a framework for? What's its use, or what are we doing with the framework? That seems a crucial question, even from within a Carnapian perspective. The first part, it seems to have been more of a comment that
Yeah, it was more than a comment. So, so if Ken is not saying anything in the messages, we can move to the last question from Alexander Linz-Bickler.
Hello, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Yes, thank you for the talk. I have just one minor point. argument. So on slide
Sorry,
8,
we lost you. We lost you a second. Can you repeat your question from the beginning?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for the talk. My question is really just minor. So on slide 8 or 9, you point out that the relation between the explicandum and the explicatum is not one of identity, but you are saying that therefore we see that Carnap is not engaged in the realist, inflationist, or essentialist agenda, and because one engaged in the realist project might still think, yes, we haven't fully captured the true essence of the concept, so we have to change it a bit. So did I misunderstand you here,
Okay.
or and I'm certainly not implying that Carnap is engaged in this project one. I'm just saying I think we need more to argue that.
Yeah. Okay. You were sometimes interrupted, but I think I got the question. So, and it seems related to an earlier question that came up. Yeah. So maybe I was too quick in saying that rejecting identity of concepts or synonymy in itself amounts to giving up the stronger notion of analysis. I think that, yeah. But on the other hand, clearly Carnap himself does that. He clearly gives up the stronger notion of analysis. So maybe I should just have said that's pointing towards that. But yeah, maybe adherents of stronger forms of analysis could admit that what we are preserving is not identity, but some core of the concept or something like that, and we are trying to analyze that in a stronger sense. Maybe that's one way of reading Tarski, for example, that he's trying to preserve that inner conceptual core in a stronger sense while giving up other things. I think that's that option is open, and I would want to see it spelled out more then. And that's not how it's usually presented. It seems to me usually you get the approach in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions and so on. So you seem to be giving that up then. What are you replacing it with exactly, and so on? That would be my question in return.
Okay, so if we don't have any follow-up, okay, I think it's already 11:51, so I think we can stop it here for today. So thank you so much, Erich, for this wonderful, stimulating talk, and the Q&A was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, and sorry again about the long delay at the beginning.
Thank you very much, Erich. Thank you so much.
A thrilling start, but it was great nonetheless. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I will advertise soon also Georg Schimmer's talk for the next time that Luca you were mentioning earlier. Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you, Erich. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, Rick.
Bye, Rick.
Bye,
Thank you very much.
Ciao.
Bye, Ken.
Rimasto.
I think you can, penso che puoi spegnere il record adesso.
Sì, adesso sì.
Bene.